NCAA, and with your paper, which was fascinating to read. I guess just start there for us, why you were interested in the topic, why this has become such a point of conversation. And I think your paper illuminated some things that not many people are talking about with regard to the various state laws and how those are going to play into the way this all gets sorted out with regard to NIL. But walk us through your interest, why you chose the topic, and maybe a little bit more about yourself through that explanation.
I'll try to hit all that, and you just interrupt me or remind me if I forget something. But can you all hear me okay? Okay, thank you. By the way, thank you for having me. It's really good to be with you this morning. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of my scholarship. So I guess a little bit about me. So I'm not as smart as Shelby. I don't have my PhD. I have my law degree, and I practiced law for 5 years coming out of law school, and then I started working in college athletics, and I worked in athletics compliance at a Big 12 school for about 7 or 8 years before I got into teaching. And so I think
you can't just gloss over that, because you were at a very particular Big 12 school during a very particularly challenging and public scandal that went on. So without taking us a mile deep into that situation, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's true. And I've kind of stopped including that when I talk to people I don't know, because I feel like the timeline, I never know if students know exactly what happened at Baylor anymore, or if they remember the headlines from a few years ago. So I've kind of stopped doing that. It's not because I'm ashamed of it or anything like that, or embarrassed of it. But yes, I was at Baylor University from the 2011 until the end of 2017. So when I started there, that was Robert Griffin III's Heisman year, and we won the Alamo Bowl, and things were great. And then at the time I left, the public was aware of a situation, and I was very intimately involved with a lot of parts of that. And even after I left, I continued to help Baylor with some things. So yes, I was at Baylor during that time period. But then came to the University of Arkansas, where I've been teaching since January of 2018. I guess with that as background, like I said, I worked in athletics compliance at Baylor, so making sure that everybody knows and follows all those fun NCAA rules. And I actually, it's kind of vogue for whether it's people who work in athletics or academics to criticize the NCAA, distrust the NCAA, hate the NCAA, et cetera. Just kind of with my background and again, my involvement with NCAA rules, I've always tried to take the opposite approach, where I try to be very fair with the NCAA, and definitely criticize it when it's warranted, but try to give the NCAA the benefit of the doubt, because they've got dozens of good people working there that I got to know, and so try to give the NCAA the benefit of the doubt. And so as it relates to this article that you read, and hopefully learned some things from, when states started passing laws that try to prohibit the NCAA from coming into their state and investigating potential violations of the NCAA's NIL policy, I wanted to take a look at whether states had a legal backing when they pass those laws. And so once I started looking into it, I kind of grew fascinated with it, and more states continue to do it. Again, it being passing laws to try to keep the NCAA out of there, including the state that I'm in right now. So that's kind of where that came from, and the project just kind of took off. And of course, I think since you invited me to come to this class, I mean, the NIL world has been shaken up again. So, so that's kind of why I did what I did, and I guess why I'm here talking to you.
So explain for us just a synopsis, I guess, of your interpretation. I mean, obviously we read the article, we see, I think the most interesting thing to me was the law of private association, and how the courts typically haven't sided with the NCAA. And that's really unique in the history of the US. It seems like that courts aren't actually siding with these private associations. Why is it, do you think, that these states felt the, I don't know, authority to issue these laws to prohibit the NCAA? Was it just, building off of that anti-NCAA sentiment that you mentioned previously, or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think everybody's kicking the NCAA while they're down right now, right? So another thing that fascinates me is, that the Alston case that came out in 2021, which to me, the NCAA should have never appealed that, the district court's decision, which they appealed it, that worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Then I think that was a major gaffe by the NCAA. And that's a whole nother conversation though. But when the NCAA did that, it allowed the Supreme Court of the United States, our country's highest court, to just smack the NCAA down. Unanimous decision, concluded that the NCAA's some of the NCAA's rules violate antitrust law. And so since then, whether it's lawyers or states, everybody's just so much more emboldened to take on the NCAA. And so these states, I think they felt that, and these state legislators started passing these laws. And I think that's why they felt that sense of aggressiveness towards the NCAA.
Anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in whenever, by the way. I've got my list here, but again, feel free to jump in whenever. So what's your take on all these laws that these states are passing? What's your interpretation of it with your background, your history? What's your interpretation of everything that's going on, and how does it all get fixed with regard to the state law specifically? Obviously, there's a whole other can of worms there that we can dive into, but with regard to the state laws specifically, that specifically prohibit the NCAA from enforcing their rules, what's the
good question. And I mean, things might have even changed since last Friday. What I thought would happen was, the NCAA would, the NCAA had started to enforce its NIL policy, right? It's interim NIL policy. We saw that with Florida State having a case and getting in a little bit of trouble for improper use of NIL and recruiting. And so I was waiting for the NCAA to go into a state and investigate a school that's in a state that has one of these laws, where again, the law says, NCAA, you can't come in here and punish one of our schools for violating your NIL policy. So that's what I thought was going to happen. It looked like that was going to happen. And then Friday happens, and Judge Corker in Tennessee says that the NCAA can't enforce some of its NIL policy. Okay, I'm going to take a second because I've got a pet peeve that the national media is saying the NCAA can't enforce any of its NIL policy. Well, that's not true. If you actually read the judge's 13-page order from Friday, it's very clear the NCAA's NIL policy is still in effect. There's just certain components of it that the NCAA can no longer enforce, and those components are using NIL improperly in recruiting. So I think the NCAA is going to be hands off for a while this thing gets figured out. Um, I think the NCAA will appeal what happened on Friday, and we'll just have to see what happens. But I thought that the NCAA would go into a state like Oklahoma or Arkansas that has one of these laws, punish a school, and then the school and or the state would say, hey, you can't come into our state, right? And I thought that would lead to a lawsuit that my paper describes. Where I thought it was a pretty close call whether these state laws are constitutional. Um, that still could happen. I would love to see that happen. I'd love to see the result of that, just because I would be very curious. But I think things are kind of on pause now.
Any questions on all that for Josh? A follow-up there, and maybe just something that I can't wrap my head around, right? You mentioned the Alston decision, and then as soon as the Alston decision happens, the NCAA rolls out these interim rules. I've had two of my classes, this class has taken a deep dive into the interim policy and all the updates since then. One of my other classes has looked at the one-page PDF document that's still up on the NCAA's website. Why was the policy so broad and vague? I mean, we've heard the president of the NCAA come out now and say, oh, we wanted to leave it up to the states. It's like, okay, well, you did, and now you're in this situation. So why was that policy initially so poorly written?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I think the NCAA, I think it was well intended. I do. I think so. For example, when I got here, when I got to the University of Arkansas, of course, we have an amazing track and field program, right? One of, if not the best in the country. We had a women's track student athlete. She's an All-American, but her real passion was cooking, right? So again, this is 6 or 7 years ago. She was an amazing cook, and she wanted to start her own YouTube channel. And I don't know that much about starting a YouTube channel, but she wanted to start a YouTube channel where she cooked, and she'd give some little tips and secrets to cooking and share recipes and things like that. But the athletics department told her, you can't do that, because I don't understand how all it worked, but essentially she would get money from YouTube, like for like advertisements and things like that. She get money for YouTube, even though it had nothing to do with her athletics ability, right? It was only about her cooking, but it was because people on the screen would do what you're doing now. You would see her face, you'd see her name, and she would be making money off her name, image, and likeness. So the school told her, no, you can't do that. And I mean, that's silly, right? That is completely silly. I mean, she's very bright. She's got her master's degree. She's an All-American. Amazing cook, amazing individual. She should have been able to make money from cooking. She should have been able to have a YouTube channel. And so I really think that when the NCAA's interim policy started, it was intended to allow things like that. Okay, so like another example was when I was at Baylor, we had an offensive lineman who in his spare time, he liked to fix cars. He liked to work on cars, and he wanted to start a business with his dad while he was playing at Baylor, where they fixed cars on the weekend, and they had a name for it, and the name used his first name. And there, I mean, that creates an issue, right? If you're using your name, image, and likeness to make money as a student athlete. At the time, that created an issue. Those are the types of things that I think the NCAA was wanting to allow. I don't think the NCAA saw collectives popping up and essentially offering big, 6-7 figures to individual athletes to come to be at a school, right? I don't think the NCAA saw that. Of course, now you hear a lot of athletics administrators saying, well, we knew all along this is what was gonna happen. I don't know how true that is. But regardless, that's where we're at. And so I don't think the NCAA saw this coming. And now, if you look at the timeline, you said you've looked at the guidance since then. So for example, May, October, all those different pieces of guidance that have come out. if you look at the timeline, it's like, okay, collectives start popping up. Okay, we get guidance. And that doesn't stop the collective. So we get more guidance, right? So I think that a lot of this has been geared toward stopping use of NIL in recruiting, right? But going back to your question, I mean, the policy didn't, it addressed using NIL as a recruiting inducement, but it just did not account for collectives and booster involvement and things like that. Um, so I think that's kind of how we got to where we are today. And now after Friday, when a federal judge says, well, NCAA, you can't enforce your NIL recruiting ban anymore. Well, you know, things just keep changing.
Do you think with that injunction being issued on Friday, and again, I don't know if the NCAA, I'll attempt to give the NCAA the benefit of the doubt with the interim policy, but if you look at all the requirements of a good policy, quote unquote, whatever that may be, there were so many things missing from that document with specificity and things like that. But with this injunction that was issued on Friday, and the lack of the ability to now enforce those specific components you mentioned, which refer to recruiting, do you think the NCAA was surprised that the court sided against them in this instance, when we have so many instances of the courts again siding against the NCAA previously as well? Or do you think this was an expected kind of course of events? Or
yeah, good question. And so this kind of goes back. I mean, this particular lawsuit, and again, you know, we're talking about the states of Tennessee and Virginia filing a lawsuit against the NCAA, trying to preclude it from being able to enforce its NIL recruiting ban. And the states initially sought what's called a temporary restraining order against the NCAA, which again would have precluded the NCAA from enforcing its NIL recruiting ban. So that happened a few weeks ago, and the NCAA won. They won the initial stage of that lawsuit. The judge said, I'm not going to issue a temporary restraining order against the NCAA. So technically, the NCAA won because there was no temporary restraining order, but the judge at the time said, but I think the case, the state's case, again, Tennessee and Virginia, I think there's a likelihood of later success, essentially, for the states. And that's what played out Friday. Friday, the Judge Corker in Tennessee granted what's called a preliminary injunction, which is an injunction before the trial. So there will still be a trial. But in the meantime, until that trial, the NCAA can't, you know, they couldn't come to University of Kansas and punish Kansas for using NIL in recruiting, right? That's illegal now. The NCAA can't do that. They're barred by this court order from doing that as of last Friday. Sorry, to answer your question, I got to come back to it. I don't think the NCAA was surprised because, again, a few weeks ago, the judge indicated, I'm not going to give you this temporary restraining order because I don't know enough about it yet, essentially. But I see a likelihood of success down the line for the states.
Yeah, and I'll ask, with this recent trends of how these laws are being passed, the current state of the NCAA and the future state of the NCAA, do you believe, or what is your take on their future, and are they going to have to really start being more lenient with these states and accepting what the future is going to bring?
Yeah, help me with your name.
I'm Tyler Fuller.
Tyler, what do you think? What do you think the NCAA's future is?
I think, I mean, me personally, I think that's what I think that they're going to have to, because it's almost out of their control in a sense that they're trying to regain control, but they're losing leverage over time. I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And it helps me to hear your thoughts too, by the way. So I think, you know, if you go back a couple summers, summer 2021, we had all these state NIL laws being passed, right? We had the Alston case come out. And the NCAA also adopted a new constitution for the first time in 25 years. That there was real substantial changes to the Constitution. And I think the NCAA kind of saw the writing on the wall that they was starting to get sued more and more under antitrust law. And antitrust law, that means, I mean, that tries to prevent people from conspiring, and it tries to encourage a free marketplace. Well, we know that for our elite Division I football and basketball student athletes, I mean, they don't have very many other options if they want to play competitively once they're done with high school, right? They don't have many options. They're probably going to want to go play college athletics and play for an NCAA university. Well, given that lack of competition for the NCAA has market power. They have market power for college athletics. And so I think the NCAA, if you look back to its constitution that it revised in 2021, it's been cognizant to try to give more authority to conferences. And in doing so, that helps the NCAA escape potential antitrust liability in lawsuits, which is good, right? I mean, that's what we want, right? We want Coke and Pepsi competing against each other to keep prices low and quality high. So the NCAA started to give more authority back to conferences over the last few years, which I think can be a good thing, because if you look at, why do we have conferences, right? It's because it's mostly similarly situated schools in terms of resources. Now, we know that geographics have kind of been thrown to the wind, at the autonomy 5 or autonomy 4, power 5, power 4 level. But the interesting thing is even though we're giving more power to conferences, I think that, the Greg Sankeys of the world, right? The commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, I think, a lot of high-level athletics directors, they still want the NCAA to exist. I think, there's going to be some out there who just hate the NCAA. They're ready to be done with it. But, we, the University of Arkansas, we'd be fine without the NCAA, right? We belong to the Southeastern Conference. We would be totally fine. We could still play, a 9-10 game football schedule and bring in a lot of revenue for our university. We'd be fine. But I don't think that doesn't mean we want the NCAA to go away. And can anybody tell me, like, what's the big reason that we want the NCAA to continue to exist? What do you think? Where do we get most of our money? March Madness, right? To me, a lot of it depends. So as you asked, what's the future of the NCAA? To me, a lot of it depends on what does the NCAA want to be, okay? If it wants to be this heavy-handed organization that punishes us for every little thing, that time has passed, right? The NCAA that I grew up with, I think that's going to go away for a while. This heavy-handed enforcer, that's going to go away for a while. I think a lot of that's going to fall on conferences. But this 68 team tournament that we love that starts next month, if the NCAA goes away, that goes with it. I mean, yes, somebody could come up, Fox Sports could come up and plan its own tournament, right? I mean, we have the NIT, we have other tournaments, but the NCAA is actually pretty darn good at men's basketball March Madness. So I really don't think that a lot of people want I think there's a lot of high level people who don't want the NCAA to go away, but I think they do want it to change. Long answer to your question.
Sir, thank you.
And to that point, maybe you can break this down for us a little bit more specifically, and you mentioned the NCAA's new constitution, and still on their website, if you look at their mission, their priorities, things like that, in there is still the word fairness. And with these state laws and things like that, it's certainly not fair anymore, especially if you're in a state like Missouri or Arkansas that has specifically, and I think Mississippi passed some similar laws the other day, if you're in a state that does allow schools to offer NIL deals to high school recruits. Like that certainly puts your state in a much different playing field than many other states like Kansas, who has not yet passed an NIL law, which has benefits to student athletes, which I've been pushing them. But it certainly doesn't seem to be quote unquote fair, or as fair as college sport can get anymore because of those state laws. So what is the process for mediating those? Do all those state laws need to get repealed at some point? What does that process look like specifically?
Yeah, that's a great point. You made a lot of great points in there, and it's a great question too. And I think, you know, if you're talking to Charlie Baker, who's the NCAA president, right? His answer, and which has been the same for a long time, is we need to get Congress involved, like federal Congress. We need the federal government to pass an NIL law. If we do that, then all these state laws go away, right?
And you mentioned a couple of weeks ago that he was maybe even thinking similar to Major League Baseball, some sort of antitrust exemption.
Right. And I think, I mean, it certainly seems, I mean, you know, if I had to bet my next paycheck, I would not bet on there being a federal NIL law, you know, anytime soon. For gosh sakes, I mean, we got enough issues going on in the world that Congress doesn't need to be, you know, paying, using its resources on name, image, and likeness in college athletics. I think the other thing that I think we'll see happen is student athletes will gain the right to negotiate with their athletics department and or their conference on working conditions, which to me, you know, and I think there's a lot of high level athletics administrators who have finally accepted that that's probably not only likely, but also there's a lot of positives to it. And I think we'll see that here in the next, I don't know, year, 2 years, 5 years at a maximum. And I think, you know, I think there's a lot of positives. There's also negatives for both sides being athletes and universities and conferences. And
to your point, Judge Corker used the word labor in his preliminary injunction, in that 13-page document you mentioned. And that leads us right into the other things I wanted to talk about. Historically, the NCAA is hidden from using the term, I mean, the term student athlete in and of itself has very interesting historical origin, but the NCAA is typically hidden behind the term student athlete to prevent themselves or anyone else from referring to student athletes as employees. And by preventing that use of the word employee, they also have been very lenient on Title IX. And that was one of our questions as a class, as we've been discussing everything going on with the NLRB, with your article and a few other cases we've been looking at. What happens if student athletes are deemed to be employees? You mentioned some of the positives and negatives. What happens? What does that look like?
I wish I knew. I wish. I just think there's so many questions that we don't know the answer to. I mean, I think that's kind of the beauty of negotiating, right? So you know, like right now, for example, you know, student athletes, they get their athletic scholarship in some sports, not all sports, right? And you know, maybe that scholarship becomes taxable now. Maybe athletic scholarships go away and we just pay athletes, you know, an hourly wage or a salary, and then they got to pay for their schooling out of that. You know, we just don't know. There's just so many questions we don't know the answers to. But you know, I think it's funny. You know, at this level, you know, I've got a dozen student athletes this year, and we have this conversation every year: benefits and negatives to being considered an employee. And at our level, student athletes are saying, no, I don't want to be considered an employee, right? I get all my education paid for. we've got this fancy cafeteria that only athletes get to eat at. You know, we get world-class travel, world-class healthcare. The food is great. I get free tutoring and all that because all those things, right? I mean, like I'm an employee, I get one polo every semester, and back when I worked in athletics at Baylor, I'd get a polo, but I'd get taxed on it, right? So athletes, if you want all this free gear, okay, we'll give it to you, but you're taxed on it, or you got to buy it. So, plus, you know, one thing that I think athletes may not realize is, you know, I mean, there's ways to be creative about this, but you can't just take an athlete's scholarship away because they miss a game-winning free throw, right? You can't just go take their scholarship away. But if all of a sudden they're employees and they're late to practice, they miss the game-winning free throw, they mouth off to coach like, okay, you're fired, right? You're fired, not you're benched, but you're fired. You're no longer an employee of University of Arkansas or whatever it is. So I think there's a lot to consider, you know, but I do see a lot of benefits. And so if we sat down and negotiated with our athletes, for example, just like, you know, in Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Players Association, well, if we do that, then something called the non-statutory labor exemption applies, and all of a sudden the NCAA is not subject to antitrust law. So I mean that eliminates a ton of the NCAA's problems. But the NCAA would also say, well, now that they're employees, now they're professionals, and we're no different from the NFL. But that's the NCAA has been saying that for over 100 years now.
And the NCAA has done a really good job over the last couple of years of kind of sweeping its old favorite term of amateurism under the rug to some extent. They've done a pretty good job of cleaning it off their website to some extent. But to your point, and with student athletes being employees, there's a lot of money in college sport, right? We had Clayton Hamilton on, who's there with you at Arkansas, on 2 weeks ago, and he broke down all the finances of Arkansas athletics, and we're talking about it in a different context with reference to the economy and inflation and things like that. But he broke down a lot of those finances for us. And again, as we've kind of seen and heard, and as we talk about in our classes here, there's two sports that are subsidizing everything else going on within an athletic department. So if they're now employees, are they getting paid in an equitable way, or is it going to be conference-based unions for these athletes and for maybe men's basketball has its union and football has its union, and then everyone else, because Sankey was quoted in a conference or in a interview last week before he went to a conference on saying that he wasn't sure if the NCAA can handle all of that. But how do the finances get sorted out with all of this? And how does that relate to Title IX too? Because that's the other federal question we have here.
Yeah, no, that's a lot of great points and questions again there. And by the way, if I'd have known Clayton was ahead of me, man, that set the bar way up here. I don't know. I would have requested to go ahead of Clayton. But so if you go back to the Alston case in 2021, right? So you've got a Supreme Court opinion, 9 justices, like the top 9 justices in the country, judges in the country, they all agreed the NCAA was violating antitrust law. Well, then you had, along with that, what we call the majority opinion, you'd also have a dissent. Justice Kavanaugh wrote what's called a dissent, where he kind of went off. He just unloaded on the NCAA in a dissent, which a dissent is not, it's not like good law that sets a case precedent for future lawsuits. But he took that occasion to just rail on the NCAA for several pages. And he brought up some of the exact issues you just did, about, so what if we start employing student athletes and paying them directly, Can we treat some athletes differently than others, right? Can our football and men's basketball athletes be considered employees and they get a wage or they get a salary? And then you got your softball, your tennis, your golf. They don't, right? They just stay what on an athletic scholarship, keep doing what we're doing there. So he brought that question up, and so he also brought up Title IX. You know, if we start going down this route, how does Title IX play into everything? And I think the answer is we don't know. Like, we just don't know yet. There's so many different possibilities. I think, I certainly think it's possible to treat some athletes differently than others, right? If we just treat our men's and women's basketball and football athletes differently now, but then what happens at the University of Arkansas where our baseball program, you know, and our track and field programs are just flourishing? There's just so many unanswered questions, but I think within the law, there is a lot of flexibility to do some things with athletes and compensate them differently than what we're doing now. But I don't know if this is something you've talked about, but Charlie Baker, the NCAA's president, a few weeks ago, he just kind of dropped this bombshell on everybody where he said, I want to talk about a new NCAA governance model. And there was a couple different components to this new NCAA governance model. And one was that all Division I universities should be able to enter NIL licensing arrangements with their student athletes. And so, I mean, that's amazing, because literally 2 years ago in our updated constitution that you've looked at, we said we're not going to pay athletes directly for use of their NIL. Now, he wasn't the president at the time, but now since he's become president, he said, hey, let's blow this thing up. Let's start entering NIL arrangements directly with our student athletes. So how does that implicate Title IX, right? University of Oregon has been sued already because some folks are saying that, you know, they're educating their male athletes differently than their female athletes when it comes to NIL. Well, we don't know how that case is going to play out yet. Another part of President Baker's new proposed NCAA model would create a new Division I subdivision. Okay, like an optional Division I, like super subdivision, you know, kind of like how we have FCS and FBS in Division I already. Well, we'd create a new subdivision that if a school wanted to join it, they could, but to do that, they have to set aside a minimum of $30,000 per year for half of their eligible student athletes. Okay, so if you do the math, I mean, for us here at the University of Arkansas, that's like $6 million a year. And so this goes into this trust fund, and then when a student athlete completes their eligibility, they get, you know, they get a portion of that trust fund money. So I mean, tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars when they graduate. So you know, how does Title IX play, you know, come into play there? I mean, I'm happy because I think for so long we haven't been the best about following Title IX, or we've exploited loopholes in Title IX within college athletics. But now our own president, if you look at this proposed model, it came out a few months ago in a letter to student athletes that he wrote, and he talks about Title IX a couple times in that letter, and how maybe we should let Title IX kind of govern student athlete compensation instead of, you know, NCAA rules and the federal government. Like, let's let Title IX, it's law. Like, let's let it do its job.
Question at this point? Good, people. So with that, and with the extensive, as you mentioned, flexibility that there is within the law for the NCAA to do certain things, and this group knows, but my stance has always been with everything that the NCAA has done over the last few years. I think the one-time transfer policy has probably been at the crux of this conversation, but no one's talking about the one-time transfer policy, which drives me nuts, right? I know all the coaches get new jobs every year, whatever. I don't care about that. The NIL would not be an issue, and convince me if I'm wrong, please. But NIL would not be an issue if that one-time transfer policy had not been installed around the same time that the NIL was passed.
Yeah, so I think, you know, and so that's been litigated as well, right? We had a judge in West Virginia a few months ago overruled, so we're not gonna let the NCAA enforce its penalty on an athlete who transfers a second time. And let's see, I was just talking to somebody the other day. So I still do, I do some consulting work on compliance issues with schools and conferences. And I was just talking to an athletics administrator the other day. And I think most in college athletics are thinking, we're not going to go back. Athletes are just going to be able to transfer freely. And so long as they're academically eligible, they're going to be able to play that next year. We're not going to make them sit a year in residence anymore in the future. So hopefully, you know, hopefully we know that, right? And that's factored into future decisions about NIL and compensation and things like that.
But that has really fueled the conversation around NIL, right? Like if not for that one-time transfer policy being instituted by the NCAA around the same time that the NIL interim policy was introduced, we probably wouldn't be in this huge legal mess that we're in college sport. At least that's my perspective. Again, if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. But
I definitely think you're onto something there.
It just seems like everybody talks about it being free agency. It's not free agency exactly, obviously, but with the creation of these collectives, as you mentioned, it certainly does create a highest bidder situation for a lot of these student athletes.
You know, somebody pointed this out to me the other day. In some ways, it's worse than free agency, right? I mean, you know, if you're, I'm trying to look, I don't see anybody wearing like a baseball or basketball, like a pro team gear, but like if you're a fan of, you know, the Chicago Cubs or the St. Louis Cardinals, like, you know how long your star shortstop is going to be on the team, right? You know how they signed a 4-year contract. You know that they can't go anyplace else, right? They're beholden to the Cubs. They're beholden to the Cardinals for the next 4 years. This is different now. You could, I mean, if the transfer portal's open, athlete gets their name in there, they can leave, and you don't know how long they're going to be around. So in some ways, I mean, this is even less predictable than free agency in some ways.
All right, so we've got 6 minutes left, and I will give you the last 6 minutes to identify and kind of lay out in your mind what college sport looks like in 5 years. Like, does fairness exist again in college sport? If so, what does that mean? What does that look like? Are all these conferences going to go independent in college football, as Chip Kelly, formerly of UCLA, now the offensive coordinator at Ohio State, mentioned in one of the more famous sound bites we've heard over the last couple months? Lay it out for us. In your ideal world, what does it look like?
All those answers, I could really I'd be working in Indianapolis at the NCAA office, and I'd be getting paid a lot more than I am right now.
Problem. You might as well do it.
Yeah, I think that we'll I think, you know, like I think this came up already, you know, like the Dartmouth case, right? With that NLRB, National Labor Relations Board ruling. I think within the next 5 years, athletes will have a chance to sit across the table from either their athletics administrators at their school and or, you know, their athletics conference. I definitely think it'll be in, you know, football and basketball. And maybe at that point, maybe why not? Maybe just make it for all sports. And we sit down and we say, okay, we want you to be able to practice, 20 hours a week and play in a couple games a week. And we just go back and forth and we negotiate, right? We negotiate working conditions, which would be pay, hours, travel, and we just start compensating athletes directly from the university, whether that's a salary or an hourly wage doesn't really matter to me, personally. But then, that kind of de-emphasizes collectives, right? Takes away some of their power. I think we'll bring NIL in-house where, University of Arkansas, we can hire 2-3 people whose job it is to facilitate NIL deals for individual athletes, right? Negotiate on their behalf, things like that, things that we're not supposed to be doing right now. Again, to de-emphasize the role of collectives in recruiting. If I had a crystal ball, I mean, those would be some of the big things. Now, all that stuff costs money, right? That's going to cost athletics departments money, but I don't really have sympathy for us. I mean, you talk to Clayton. I mean, Clayton manages a $140 million budget, right? I mean, we don't have to pay our head men's basketball coach a 6-figure bonus for having, a team GPA of 3.0, right? Like, that should already be happening. That's part of his contract. So, I think there's definitely ways we can save some money and spread that around to our athletes a little bit more in the next several years.
And one of the other interesting things you hit on there with the allocation of funding in college sports, over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, however long it's been, coaches' salaries have garnered a greater percentage of institutional finances in most Power 5 schools. And talking to Clayton, he says, yeah, I think we're going to see more funding move toward the student athletes themselves. So he might be alluding to what you're saying here with student athletes being deemed employees. But the curious thing to me is that we see all this movement in coaching now because of NIL and the transfer portal and things like that. I don't see how we'll keep coaches if we don't pay them more either. And like, I don't know, there's a rub there that, again, a whole bunch of unknowns, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it all works out. And unfortunately, it seems like this is all going to take a while to get sorted out. So we might not have quote unquote fair college sport for maybe another 5 years, truthfully. Court cases keep popping up all over the country and Congress refuses to get involved.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
So anybody have any last questions, thoughts, comments for Professor Lenz before we let him get out of here today? No? Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. It's good to see you as always. I hope all is well in Fayetteville. And if there's ever anything we can do for you or help you out with, please let us know. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Hey, appreciate it. Nice to spend some time with you.